Hi everyone, Helen Blunden here, or at Activate Learn on Twitter. It is time for another book review. No, I'm not lying. When I was younger, my mum used to say to me, Helen, I know that you're lying. It's because your nose grows. So you can imagine me as a kid when I would say a lie or three. I would stand there saying the blatant lie, but I'd be doing this. My mum knew I was lying. So the book I'll be reviewing today is Carlo Collodi's The Adventures of Pinocchio. Look how old this book is. It is a book that belongs to my husband, and he told me that he saved up a lot of money, well, saved up a lot of money for an 8-year-old to go and buy this book. You can even see the price for $2.88. And I thought to myself after I read this, my God, he would have had guts as an 8-year-old to read this book and not have nightmares. So let me tell you about the book. Now, the book is about a puppet, as we all know, Pinocchio, who wants to be a real boy. That's his ultimate dream. Now, what we don't know is Pinocchio's a real shit. He's a real shit of a boy. He was described as a rascal, an imp, a wretched boy. That was even from his father, Geppetto. Thing is, someone finds a piece of wood, they start to carve the piece of wood, but this wood becomes alive. That was my first freak out section of this book when I first started reading it. So he hands that piece of wood to Geppetto, who's the wood carver in his village. And Geppetto doesn't have a son. Geppetto is very, very poor, and he carves this piece of wood and makes a puppet. The puppet comes alive and steals Geppetto's wig and runs out the door. As you do. Before that he gets kicked by the puppet. So as you can see, Pinocchio is a real shit of a kid right from the start, and it just gets worse. As we follow Pinocchio through his adventures, the whole reason he goes on these adventures is the fact that his father, Geppetto, sold his coat so that he could buy a book for Pinocchio, a school book. His whole dream was to get Pinocchio study, to go to school and learn to be a good boy, just like other good boys. But that was the furthest thing from Pinocchio's mind. In fact, he wanted nothing to do with study or learning. All Pinocchio wanted to do was to play with other boys and go on these adventures, as little boys do, right? But what happens is he's so innocent. There's innocence and there's just stupidity, and I think he was the latter. Anyway, but I am reading this as a older female who doesn't have children, and he gets sometimes very impatient with them. Don't flame me. I'm saying the truth here, okay? Anyway, so what's happened is Pinocchio sets off to go to school, school book under his arm, but he comes across these characters, and these characters are all kind of like animals that talk and who have some kind of sinister intent. Their whole intent is to get him off the path towards school and towards goodness and going off onto different adventures. Now, I shouldn't call them adventures. They should be called like horror misadventures. As Pinocchio goes through these terrible things and these adventures that stray him off the path for months on end, we see him starved, tortured, his legs burnt off. We see him strung up on a tree, hanged to die. We see him turn into a donkey. We see him being eaten by a dogfish. We see him being nearly fried alive for someone to eat him, mistaking him for a fish. So all these adventures, and you just go, man, what the hell is going on here? And he doesn't seem to be learning his lesson. Every chapter is just another torture, another beating, or another head punch, or another near-death experience, another starvation experience. Anyway, but he just doesn't seem to learn. He's just seems to want to not go to school and decides, oh, it'll be all right. Geppetto will wait for me. You know, my blue fairy, my mum will wait for me. So the themes that were added this book was the fact that study hard, work hard, good things will come to really good boys if you do that and if you love your parents. Another theme was the fact that regardless if your kid's a little shit, parents will always love you. Parents love unconditionally, and that really came out strongly with Geppetto and the Blue Fairy in here. In the end, Pinocchio does become a little boy, but I think it's not because of the fact that, you know, he did good or whatever. I think Pinocchio deep down has a good heart, and he sees what he's doing. He actually understands that the actions he takes take him off the straight path. So while all these terrible things are happening to him, he is like full of woe and sadness for himself. I just want to go, come on, wake up, Pinocchio, just do something right. Anyway, so he's full with woe and sadness, and he's always thinking back, you know, you know, is my father still around? You know, what will my father think? So he's always thinking about his parents. He's just at the spur of the moment, he just seems to stray off the right path. So reading into the author's background, Carlo Collodi was apparently a civil servant. He used to write for a newspaper, and he wrote books for adults. And Pinocchio, the story of Pinocchio, was a series in one of the Italian newspapers in 1883. This is when he wrote the book. Now, at the time, he wanted to kill off Pinocchio, and the scene, the chapter where Pinocchio is hung up on a noose, swaying in the wind and suffocating, really, my heart was pumping when I was reading that. I just thought, my God, how can you let kids read this? This is horrible, horrible what's happening. Anyway, so Carlo Collodi was going to have Pinocchio killed off in this chapter, but because it was so popular, because the story was so popular, the editor asked him to continue the story, but as I guess a continuation of the story was, yes, he'd stay alive, but the things that he would go through would be ultimately much worse. So I don't know if Carlo Collodi, when I read this book, I had images of the child catcher of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and I had images of Lord of the Flies as well. I don't think this is a book to read to your kids unless you want to give them nightmares, unless you really want to force them to think that if they do bad things will happen. And I think this is obviously the whole theme of the story. My husband, reading it as an 8-year-old man, he would have had guts to read this and swallow it, but maybe kids back then were different. I don't know. But that's my reading of Pinocchio. He does become a little boy in the end, thankfully, and I do hope he's learned his lesson. But you know what? It doesn't matter. I've been reading this as an adult. And as I read it as an adult, I know I'm reading it as an adult, and I shouldn't get angry, or I shouldn't get like this for Pinocchio, because little boys, little children are little children. They don't know the right from wrong, but it is up to the parents, their unconditional love, to show them the right way. That's it.